episode 74 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. I'm Dave Kaloran in sunny but chilly Napa Valley.
And this is Jon Dinning in just sunny Los Angeles.
You don't have the chills down there?
I don't. No, it's just kind of beautiful out.
Well, look at you.
I know, as I see it through a window.
I don't know why you're recording this with me when you could be outside.
Could I? Could I be outside?
No.
Yeah.
Now, there's some good stuff to talk about, but of course, the most important thing to talk about is in this holiday season, Jon, what are you drinking?
Well, good for us both going a bit festive. I have got a cocktail here that you recommended called a Christmas Buck. Buck, I presume being the stag variety as opposed to the currency. It's bourbon, most importantly, and a little bit of cranberry juice and a little bit of club soda. It's quite good.
It doesn't sound bad.
Yeah.
Which, is saying something for me, because usually I listen to what you're drinking, I'm like, that sounds terrible. But I like the sound of this one.
Yeah.
I like cranberry juice with alcohol, so that's a really good start. And then the club soda would level that out a little bit. So
yeah, club soda seems to be kind of like balancing it. What about you? I'm sure you've got something more elaborate.
I don't know if it's more elaborate, but it is certainly quite festive. This is a peppermint white Russian.
Like I said.
So it's really the standard white Russian that I drink, which is an ounce of Kahlua, really more like an ounce and a half or two, and then the same amount of Tito's vodka and then milk. But you make it a peppermint version by putting like about a half ounce of Rumpelminz in here, which I like to drink straight, by the way. So if anyone ever says we're taking shots, I'll take Rumpelminz shots.
You're a maniac. You're a proper maniac.
It's just schnapps, man.
Ugh.
The Russians do this all the time. And then the wife put a little candy cane garnish on this. So I feel very Christmassy.
That's nice.
And holiday-ish.
Speaking of Christmas, you need to send me your daughter's wish list. I've got a few days left where I can still send her a Christmas present. And this has been weighing heavily on me.
You should have asked me earlier then.
Well, here we are.
The list that she has is lengthy.
Good. As it should be.
So I'm sure there are many options for you to choose from.
And she deserves all of it, by the way. I hope you fulfill.
No, she does not.
Yes, she does. How dare
She's
you.
a sweetheart, but no child deserves everything on their wish list. You got to have something to seek and pursue.
Okay. Well, you send me a couple things and I'm going to fulfill it.
All right, I'll do that after we're done here.
Thanks, bud.
Well, in honor of our topic tonight, which is about guessing strategy, interestingly enough, we've chosen a band that I think is quite apropos of that, and that is a Canadian legendary band, the Guess Who.
Yes, sir.
And some of you are like, who? And I'm like, right, well, they got Guess in their name, so we had to use them. It's just too obvious if we're going to talk about guessing strategy to have this kind of click in. But this is a band from the 60s and 70s that kind of did a little Beatles thing where they were very melodic and kind of poppy and then turned a little harder rock and edgier.
Yeah.
And the song we've chosen is kind of like a double song, which I always find to be really cool. It's called New Mother Nature / No Sugar Tonight. Probably one of my favorite songs by them. And Jon, I'll be honest, I've never really listened to them a whole lot because some of the songs like These Eyes and Undone are great, but I never really liked them. And they also did American Woman, which I don't love. But I started listening to them this summer, and they're incredibly good.
Yeah, they were a remarkable band. I'm kind of proud of you for coming along with this song choice. This is right up my alley. This is exactly what I would hope for.
Well, they're really good. I have to say that I've listened to them on repeat a lot this summer while I was doing various things, and I was like, man, they really got overlooked, even though I think they're in the Rock and Roll Music Hall of Fame. I think that's the case.
If not, they should be.
It's also really interesting.
Yeah,
they should be.
Yeah,
I'd have to
this
agree
our petition if they're not.
Yes, because they're always listening to us.
Right.
Also, Randy Bachman, the guy who's the guitarist on most of the big hits they had, was the guy who then formed Bachman-Turner Overdrive. And they do the song Taking Care of Business, which was a huge hit. And I was reminded of that because yesterday we were making dinner and there was a holiday music station playing, and on came that song, or so I thought. but it was Randy Bachman with somebody else, I think some country singer, and they changed the song to "Taking Care of Christmas." And I had to say that I said to Amanda, "Turn that off."
Yeah.
I can't. It's an abomination.
You can't see me right now, but my posture just changed. I was deflated. What a
It
shame.
was
What a shame.
a surprise move. Anyway, he's still a great guitarist. They're an interesting band. This song in particular is one of my favorites, certainly of 2020. And I've listened to a lot of music in 2020. So check it out if you aren't familiar with it, or even if you are.
Yeah. Gotta love the Guess Who. Well done, you.
Thank you.
What about the LSAT world? What's been going on?
It's been very silent in a kind of like nice and comfortable way. We have this long break between the November and the January LSAT, which, John, for you and I in years past, this was normal.
Mm-hmm.
And breaks of multiple months were kind of like something we were used to, especially between February and June. And recently, it's just been like a constant lineup every month of another test happening. So all of a sudden, to have a whole month without a test has felt like, well, I'll be honest, nirvana.
It has felt, like this incredible reprieve. It's short-lived because the onslaught resumes.
It will. Right now, it's such the application season, and everybody trying to get their applications in by Christmas, by the holiday breaks that we have here.
Yeah.
That I think everyone's focused there. I see a lot of the LSAT traffic is down, but everybody who's taking it in January and February, we know that it's on your mind. You've got a big break coming up here, hopefully. And you should use that, put that to good use, and spend a lot of time studying because you've got enough time before this test. So let's run down what's going on.
Sure.
What's coming up here in January?
Well, I mean, the most immediate thing, I suppose, for anyone paying attention is the January LSAT. It's originally it was set for the weekend of, I think, the 16th and 17th, but the volume of this is clearly going to spread it out through the week. Has LSAC actually announced the days of the week that they're going to extend this to? If they have,
No.
I'm not familiar with it.
I think they're going to wait. LSAC typically takes a week-long break between Christmas and New Year's.
Right.
All right, so I haven't seen that they're going to do that this year, but they've been doing it for so long, I would be stunned if they didn't do it. And I think after they come back, we may see some movement. But that test we know will start on the 16th and then go for at least 2 days. I would suspect 4 days because there are when I checked the other day, there were 39,600 plus people registered. It is a massive size test.
Yeah. Biggest flex yet.
Yeah. And it'll come down a little bit. They'll lose, a percentage of those people who either don't show up or change their minds or postpone, all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So it won't be 39,000. It will come down a little bit. But normally what they do is about 10 days in advance, they will open up the signups for the days. And I think what we will find is that that's around January 6th. Mm-hmm. Usually what they want to do is do that on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. So if you're kind of like planning this out, they usually do not use Monday or Wednesday as the big announcement days. Too many other things going on. So they've told me this several times that they like to do it in midweek. So January 6th was probably about the date that we would see. And I would assume that a couple days before that, if not earlier, which would be nice, they'll let us know, hey, we're going to add Tuesday and Wednesday, for example, or whatever they choose to do. I'm not sure what their plan is at this point. And I thought about, getting in contact with the people I know there, but I was like, man, they don't want to hear from me. They're enjoying the break from me, I'm sure.
Right.
They're happy. They're like, go away, Dave.
Yeah, go away, Dave. Speaking of that exact same sort of timeline, that's also the registration deadline for the February test, January 6th, which is a much smaller, at this moment, test. I think there's just over 8,000 people or so registered for February, compared to almost 40,000 for January. Those numbers will change, but January 6th is the registration deadline for February.
Yeah, I don't know if they have both those dates on the 6th. I don't know if that pushes the January test selection to the 5th or the 7th. Mm-hmm. I'm not actually sure what would be preferable there for them. But you can imagine that week's going to be a pretty big one. And that February test will grow for sure.
Yeah, for sure. But, I mean, that January, those numbers are staggering. compared to what, 16,000 last year?
Everything about this year has been staggering in one form or another. I think we can both agree. Certainly, that January number, I would assume, has caught everybody off guard in Newtown, Pennsylvania, because I think they thought that these were going to be smaller tests, because traditionally they have been,
Right.
and that's not what we're seeing. I'll be really fascinated to see what the number of first-time test takers turns out to be from that number, because right now I can't see that. They'll announce it later on. They post it on their website, actually, where they post up all the information about scores and so forth. So we'll get to see that, but they've got to be thinking to themselves, this is a ton of people.
Yeah.
And that's not, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because as we know, there are now more people applying this year to law school. We know that there currently is a scoring bubble at the highest scores. I don't think there's going to be enough people throughout the rest of the year to bring that down back to what would be normal levels.
Right.
So we're going to have to live with that throughout the rest of the year. So I'm sure everybody will be want to track that number very closely and see what happens with it.
Yeah, anyone listening to this hearing that for the first time, I'm sure just cringed, as they should, because this is the most competitive cycle I've seen in a very long time.
It's still not as competitive as things were, say like a
2010?
decade.
Yeah, 2010,
Yeah,
2011.
you go back like a while. We're fortunate to have that kind of perspective. There are days in the past where it was far more competitive than it is now. It's just that it feels more competitive than the last year or two, and it's always frustrating. Notice that one of the strategies that students are using, though, is to apply to more schools.
Mhm.
The applications per applicant is, in fact, up. So this is something to think about, and I've seen various people that I know and trust in this industry talk about this as well. And what they've said is, hey, just cover your bases. If you are thinking to yourself, look, I'm only applying to the T3. First off, I would say that's a very dangerous strategy anyway.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what day.
Yeah, your
or
40
month or
and
year it is.
180 is still no guarantee.
There's no guarantees at those schools,
Right,
friends.
right. Friends.
Maybe what you want to do is like pull a few schools that you feel are a little bit more in the safety zone that are out there. So just something to keep in mind. I realize that does drive up the costs, and that's frustrating, but maybe you can get a chain reaction where you can use one scholarship to negotiate the next and so on down
Right.
the line and make that money back. And that's what the whole thing is, whether it's LSAT preparation or applying to more schools or working on your apps, is trying to leverage as much money out of the school as possible and then get repaid for what is essentially an investment in your future.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it's a scary prospect to be applying right now because of how competitive things are. But there are still things you can do, I think, to aid your cause, and we can help.
Indeed we can. And we've talked about those in the past.
Sure.
So let's move on and talk about the main event here, which I think, John, you and I speculate that this won't be the most lengthy conversation we've ever had.
I think we're both crossing our fingers that it won't. We'll see what happens.
However, I also know that you and I say that all the time,
Yeah.
and then things end up going really long. We're like, how did that happen?
Yeah, we spiral off into nonsense. So we'll see where this goes.
Let's talk about guessing, because this is something that I see come up a lot in terms of questions. And in my view, there's actually a fairly deep misunderstanding about the way guessing works on this test.
True.
And I've seen people argue very strongly about it's irrelevant and these types of things. And I'm like, yeah, if I took your assumptions to be true, it would be irrelevant. However, your assumptions aren't true. And so you're wrong.
Yeah, that would make this the shortest conversation ever if it was just random. If we were like guessing, roll the dice.
We'll
pick a
get to
letter.
that.
Right.
Let's get to that in just a moment, because I think that's a really important point. But let's first off just define exactly what we're talking about.
Perfect.
And it should be, I think, clear to everybody. We're talking about when you cannot finish questions, or you can't ultimately make a selection on a problem. Maybe you just read it and you're like, I have no clue whatsoever. The first question that students ask when they come to the LSAT is, should I guess? Should I just pick an answer of some sort? And the answer, without question, is of course.
Yes.
You definitely want to do that. And here's the reason. There's no penalty for guessing. You get credit for correct answers on this test. You do not get a penalty for missing answers. That's not the case on every standardized test out there. You know, like the SAT, that used to be in the situation where you'd miss a question and they would take like a quarter of a point off.
Exactly. Yeah, the old version of the SAT.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't trying to say that was, what they're doing right this minute.
Right.
I was just kind of saying you have these situations. Well, a lot of people took that test and then they're like, oh, I better not guess unless I'm able to eliminate a couple. But that's not the case. And I've always said that this is a position of strength by the test makers. They feel their test is so good and so accurate and so well made that even if you can't finish it and you guess, it's not going to change your score appreciably.
Right.
That's a statement of pure power. Go ahead, take some free shots. We don't care. It's not going to change a thing. I don't know. You agree with me on that?
I do. In fact, I mean, it's kind of a, speaking of flex, it's kind of a flex where they can say, yeah, give us your best blind shot. And that's really what we're talking about here. Is we're talking about blind guessing, not educated guesses, not I'm down to 2. These are questions you have not been able to make any kind of inroads into. What do you pick? That's what we're discussing.
Thanks for that. Yeah, thanks for that clarification, because that's exactly the case.
Yeah.
We're talking about, hey, I can't get to questions 22, 23, and 24. What should I do?
Right.
If you've reduced it down on question 19 to A and C, don't use guessing strategy to say, I better choose D.
Yeah. At that point, use your
know?
intuition, use your own sort of decisiveness.
Yeah, and don't use the statistics that you're aware of to then
Right.
decide between A and C as well. All bets are off once you've actually done the question and you have feelings about it. Then it's about the answers that you're looking at.
Exactly right.
And it's worth your time if you're down to 2 to actually complete it and not just guess and move on. So that's an important distinction.
Yeah.
Because I see people wanting to do that all the time. Well, I know A doesn't show up a whole lot, and now I'm down between A and C, so I'm going to choose C. And I'm like, stop right there. That is not how it works. This is far too localized versus like the generality of all numbers for you to make a decision like that. It's apples and oranges at that point.
You raise an interesting point about localization, because obviously we're going to have to talk about this in the broad sense. Trends over time, trends over sections, but the odds that question 21 is A or C obviously is dependent on question 21. And so you'll have to, again, use your kind of intuition, your inroads that you've made into that. But we're discussing this from a much broader field.
Yeah, and so let's talk about how this works and really why it matters. So what we did, because it's just part of how we do things here, we like to take a very analytical approach and a statistical analysis mindset into things. And we've been doing this for years.
Mm-hmm.
I think we were the first people to ever start publishing stats about how this worked. I've seen other people use our stats. I don't often see people put stats out there. It's happening a little bit more these days, which I think is great. But originally what we did was we started looking at all the answers that we had, and we looked for all sorts of different patterns. Mm-hmm. To see if there was anything. Like one of my favorite things to track is like the number of answers that are the same answer in a row.
Right.
Like 4 C's in a row. And, that's the kind of thing that does occur. And I always just found that fascinating because I think that's a kind of like a psychological mind screw over.
That's exactly what it is.
That's
mind. Precisely what it is.
There's a different word I wanted to use there.
I'm proud of your restraint.
I'm keeping this safe for work.
I'm not sure I've ever said that to you before, but I'm proud of your restraint.
Look at that. First time for everything.
I know.
But that, you do, let's say you do a couple of C's, you do that third one, you're like, okay, the next one's not going to be C. And then the next one is C, and you're like, no. There's one section where 6 out of 7 answers I think are in fact C. And I was like, boy, those people just had to be feeling like, no way that's the case. I must have missed one of those in there.
Yeah.
So we started looking for things like that. And then in the process of doing that, we started compiling all these databases about these are all the answers in all the sections. And then we just said, well, what's the most common one? And it turned out, as we will talk about, that it wasn't entirely what we expected. It was a little bit different. And then we started looking at all sorts of other little things, the last 5 answer choices in a section. I've looked at the last question in every game, last question in every reading comprehension section. I've looked at segments, say questions 15 to 19 in logical reasoning. We have sliced and diced it every single way, looking for some type of trend or pattern. And I just think that's doing a good job. that's really what we should do. But people will say, and they have a point initially, that look, they're going to make it random. That's what the whole point is. They're going to just make it 20%. And this is what you said before, John. You mentioned the randomness shouldn't just be a 1 in 5 chance for everything, and it doesn't matter what you guess.
If the test wasn't designed with the degree of intent that we know it is built upon, then yes, it would be completely random. It'd be a lottery. They'd just be pulling, letters out of a hat. But this test is built around, as you just said, 6 and 7 C's. This is built around psychological manipulation. This is built around their ability to control the people who take it. And with that degree of intent, of course, it's no longer random. Everything is purposeful.
I agree with you on that. Why would they leave something like this unexamined?
Precisely.
And just kind of like, to the whims of chance? They're not going to. They can use this as another tool to attack people, and so they will use it, and they do. Now, if you're a person who says, well, no, it's random for sure, the episode's over for you.
Bye.
I'm glad you listened so far. And this sometimes happens. I've had people argue with me online before about it, and I'm like, okay. I have the benefit of having the statistics, and a lot of times what they will say is, no, it's just random. I'm like, I can agree with that just as a general principle until I look at the numbers. And there are things, we'll talk about them tonight, that I see inside the numbers that are in no way random and that are clearly done with intent. They are multiple standard deviations outside of what is expected, and they show the hand of the maker in action.
That's really well said. Yeah, there are some stark instances where purpose is clear.
Yeah, so that's the first criticism that you get when, people sometimes post like this guessing strategy and they start asking about it is, well, it's just random. No, it is not. And it is especially non-random in the last set of questions in each each section, as we will get to. The other criticism that I've heard leveled is like, okay, I'll accept that. I convince them that, in fact, this is something that is being done with intent and is purposeful. And they'll be like, okay. And they'll be like, how do you know it's going to keep happening? And I'm like, okay. They found something that works for them and they're happy with, and now they're just going to throw it away.
Right.
The best criticism of guessing strategy is that it is built upon the broadness. When we look at these guessing strategies, we look at it from the mass of all tests. And I've even sliced it into individual years, 5-year periods, 10-year periods, and it doesn't change a lot. But the truth of the matter is that when you start using numbers from that many exams, 90 plus tests, what you end up with is that any given test could actually deviate from the expectations. That's the best criticism. The problem is, and this is why that criticism doesn't hold any water, is that you don't know when that's going to happen. If you could predict when that's going to occur, fantastic, but you cannot do that, and you can bet that I have tried, John.
I know you have. Your data dive on this is remarkable. You know more about this. I'm going to wager you know more about this than anyone in the world.
I won't take that bet because there are people in Newtown who are the ones doing it who know more than I do.
Fair point. You know more about this than anyone in the world willing to discuss it. How about that?
Fair enough.
All right.
Yeah, they won't talk to us about that.
Right.
So that whole idea there is that we know that there's intent that is actually occurring. It is going to continue to happen. It keeps happening over and over again. And so to me, the past is prologue. What we see in the past is going to continue to happen, and you can use that to your advantage. And so that's what this is all about. This is, our whole goal in doing this podcast and doing courses and doing tutoring and doing admissions consulting is to give you advantages and to help out. Some of that's free, some of it's paid. There's a whole variety there. But the goal is always the same, to give benefit and to make people better at this test. And if this gets you one extra question, it's worth it.
Yeah.
The whole conversation is worth it.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the test then. Let's talk about how this all breaks down.
Yeah, let's use some statistics. And there's so many that I think we'll try to simplify it and not make it this ridiculous recitation of numbers and percentages. So we know that there are 5 answer choices for every single question on the test. If you were to divide that randomly, what you would see is that it would be 20%, 1 out of 5 for each one of them. And over time, what we've seen is that it is fairly consistent, where it deviates a little bit from that. The most common answer out of all 5 is D. It is 21%. It's been coming down a little bit, but it is more common than, say, A and E, which show up at about the same rate, which are about 19%. So that 2% difference, some people are like, oh, that's not that huge. That's almost 200 answers over the lifetime of the test that were D more often than A or E. And so C, interestingly enough, is right in the middle. It's about 20%, and then B is close to 21%, but it's just under. So just adding that all together, from a percentage standpoint, A is 19.2, B is 20.8, C is 20, D is 21, and E is 19.1. That's the whole test. So based on that, the most simple guessing strategy that you can employ is just guess D. If you don't have a clue, you can't get to the problem, just guess D. It's a slight advantage. But as I said before, I'll take any advantage. I will scrape and claw for an advantage.
Sure.
However, that to me is like taking a sledgehammer
to something that needs a scalpel.
To a crystal, Christmas ornament. It's not going to fix it. It's going to smash it to smithereens. And I think it's more useful for us to start looking inside the sections, because that's, I think, the first part. John, you want to run through those?
I agree. Yeah. Let's talk about the 3 sections then. They hold pretty close to what the overall test is, which is that D is the most common. Logical reasoning and reading comprehension in particular seem to favor D. D in logical reasoning is about 21.3%. A and E, again, sort of underperforming. A is 18.8, E is 18.9, B and C are 20.7 and 20.3, respectively. That's logical reasoning. Reading comprehension, 21.3 again for D. And the rest of the answers hold pretty similar. A, 19.5, E, 18.5, B and C, 21.1 and 19.7, respectively. So again, you see D as the slight favorite in each of those. But I do think it's more interesting to actually look at these sections individually. Despite the fact that D still holds up, the numbers shift a little bit as you run through these.
They really do. And given that LR and RCR, I think, are relatively similar in the way they arc out, let's talk about what I find interesting, and then we'll begin to see the hand of the maker in play here. So logical reasoning overall in the section, D, 21.3%, is the most common. A is the least common at 18.8%. Now, you take a look at that for a moment, you're talking about 2.5 percentage points there. That's a significant difference. It is statistically significant at that level, and you're starting to show that the randomness that you would expect is disappearing.
Yeah.
So they're moving off of A when it comes to logical reasoning, and they're pushing the answers more towards that B, C, and D era. And I've often said this about the way I see their thinking on this with logical reasoning, is that you do a logical reasoning problem, and let's say you come out of it, you're not entirely sure, you have a decent feel but not a great feel. They don't want to give it to you right off the bat, and so A is not the right answer. I'll tell you when A actually turns into be a much higher than expected is when the question stem is really weird. If you get a weirdly worded question stem in logical reasoning, the answer choice percentage for A skyrockets.
Interesting. So it would be, if someone's reading between the lines there, if you're asked something that you don't understand, guess A.
Pretty much. I always found that interesting. And of course, the idea is that if you read a question stem and it's like, what the heck did they just say? You go to A, you're still thinking about the question stem. The answer happens to be right, but you don't even understand it because you're like, what was the question? Then you get into B, C, D, and E, and you start debating among those four because it starts to make a little more sense.
Yeah, it eludes you.
But you've already dismissed A because it made no sense.
Yeah.
So that's a very odd variant on this. But let's say the question is just a normal one. Which one of the following most weakens the argument? They don't want to make it easy, so they don't give it to you in A. Then they start giving you answers that are more likely B, C, and D. And then E drops back down. It drops down to about 18.9%, very close to A historically. And my thinking there is the last thing that people read often resonates in their mind. And if the last thing they read is the correct answer, the test makers are trying to say, we don't want to make it that easy. We don't want that to ring in your mind and all of a sudden be like, that's it. And so they bury the answer in the middle.
Yeah.
And look, this is relative by bury. We're talking about 2.5 percentage point swing. So it's not like they just doing it constantly. Significant, yes, but not like murderous, or they're totally evil.
Well, it's not a staggering dissonance, but I mean, 2.5 percentage points when you figure that this should actually balance out over thousands and thousands of questions. That's a big deal. Again, it shows intent.
And so you think about that. They don't want to give it to you right off the bat. They don't want it to be the last thing you read. And so the correct answer more likely to be in the middle. So if you're just guessing randomly in logical reasoning, you are better served to guess somewhere in the middle, typically on the section as a whole. And we'll see a difference in this when we get to the last 5 where it really becomes obvious. But just hold that thought in mind. And again, I want to caution people from thinking, okay, so if I'm doing a problem, I'm down between A and D, I should choose D. No. All right. I know that might sound counterintuitive, but the guessing strategy is only for you never looked at the problem. Once you're doing the problem, you got to use that information.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, John, reading comp's almost the same type of thing.
I was going to say it holds almost identical for reading comp. Yeah.
And so it's really the same type of analysis to me. In fact, E is even less likely there. It's the lowest between LR and RC. It's 18.5% of the answers in reading comprehension are E. Again, statistically significant variation when the high one is 21.3.
Yeah, another 2.8 here. So
yeah,
I mean that's
a big difference to me.
That's a big difference. Yeah.
And if this was 10 answers or a single test, nobody cares. This is hundreds and hundreds of answers in each section, adding up over time, and they should go towards the norm, which would be a straight 20%. But this, again, is just the overall section. So if you're just guessing in the section in general, both logical reasoning and reading comprehension are D. Games switches it up a little bit.
It does.
What does games do?
Well, that's why I kind of cut it off with LR and RC as I was running through. Games actually has a slightly different favorite. Games has answer choice B as the most common at 20.6%. A is 19.8, C is 19.6, D is 19.9, E 20.1. So a much, in my estimation, a much even or more even kind of distribution of things here. B doesn't have quite the spike that D did in LR and RC. But in games, B is the most common answer.
And again, I think we'll see this even more so in the individual sections, so I almost hesitate to talk about it too much. But if you take a look at the way this actually works, here they need to move some answers a little bit earlier because they've been avoiding them. And so they're able to up the percentages here, in part because games is less about examining each answer. And sometimes there's a number of instances where you come out and you know what the answer is. Right. What's the maximum number of spaces between F and J? And the answer is 3. Well, it doesn't matter that answer choice A is 2, and then 3, and 4, and so on. You're just going to go right to 3. And so they don't have to worry so much about the first thing you read and the last thing you read. Games is much more defined in that sense. You also are going to end up doing the work anyway. So there's less of an incentive to make you work through all the answers.
Right.
And in reasoning and reading comprehension, the more answers you have to read and analyze fully, and I'll qualify this in a moment, the more work you're doing mentally.
Sure.
Whereas if you go through a problem in reasoning, you get to answer choice C and you really like it, you're still going to read D and E. but you still are spending the time with that. In games, once you know that M must be third, you usually don't spend a whole lot of time with the other answers. You're just like, M is third, that's the answer. You're on to the next one. So it's a much faster process of analyzing the game's answers because all the time is spent in actually doing the little mini work and set up an analysis there.
It's more permissible to put right answers earlier in games because right answers are right. It's not relative. They're not comparative.
All right. So that's the overall section, which you start to see little differences. We took the overall, here's the percentages, it's D. Now you look at the individual sections, reasoning and comp are D, games is B. I think we could stop there and be like, okay, that was fun. It wouldn't be entirely convincing, though. It'd be like, well, they're just saying, 2.5%, that's not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
And so I don't use those examples when I'm like, here's the hand of the test maker in action. I use what we're about to talk about, which is where most people are actually guessing. And that is in the last 5 questions per section.
As the section ends, I'm still trying to wrap my head around who might think that was fun. But I do take your phrase. To me, this is more fun's a stretch, but interesting. I think what happens in the final questions is kind of fascinating as the percentages break down. So let's talk about that.
So let's take a look at logical reasoning, because this to me is probably the most definitive argument that can ever be made for it's not random.
Exactly.
So in the last 5, let's just look at the percentages from A to E, and I'm going to read all of them. And I just took a drink of that peppermint white Russian, and it's good. Now my voice is messed up.
Oh, okay. Go
All
ahead.
right. In the last 5, in logical reasoning, answer choice A shows up 15.1% of the time.
Wow.
That is statistically unlikely to happen just from, flipping it over and over and over again. This is intentional. They are avoiding A in the last 5, and there is a clear reason. You're struggling, you're doing question 22, you're trying to finish the test, you just get down to it, you're not totally sure, you see A, that makes a lot of sense, and you guess it, and you get it right. No, that's not how the test makers want this to work.
Right.
They want you to see A and be like, I don't know. B, it's okay. C is okay, and then the real answer's down in D and E, but you just ran out of time. You don't get to it. They're trying to push you through the problem so that you can't just cherry pick quick answers. And how do we know that? Because B is 19.5%, C is 19.8%, and here comes D and E, 22.4% on D, and then E is 23.3%.
Yeah.
There's an 8.2% differential between A and E in the last 5 in logical reasoning. That is not accidental. To me, that puts to rest the entire argument that many people have thrown out there that it's like, it's just random, it doesn't matter. No, it isn't.
Yeah. That E could occur almost 10% more often tells you this is all done with intent. It's all done for a reason. And you just explained the reason very well, so I won't rehash it.
So then let's go to reading comprehension. Because, well, they got to have some A's on this test somewhere. Is it reading comprehension in the last 5?
It is not.
Nope. They don't want the same cherry-picking advantage. It's 16.4%. A little better, but it's statistically significant once again that the variance would be this large. It's supposed to be 20% if it's random. Here it's down at 16.4. That didn't happen accidentally. Now, they do a little bit of a benefit in reading comprehension. B is actually the most common answer. It is 22.9%. C drops back down to 18.3. D jumps back up at 22.3. And then E is 20%. And my theory on this has been, look, they just needed to avoid A. And with reading comprehension, you already were forced to do all this work in terms of going through the passage. Like, you sank the time in. They were able to suck the time out of you that they wanted. Just same thing happens in logic games. And so they're a little more comfortable with moving the answer up earlier because they already know you've done a lot of the timed work that's required. And just so people are clear on this historically, it has varied between D and B in reading comprehension. So there have been times in the past where you could look at this and be like, D was actually a little bit more common than B rises, and then D rises. It kind of goes back and forth. So in both reasoning and reading comprehension, D's not the most common in the last 5, but it's the second most common in each.
It's on the podium. In LR, it's D or E. In reading, it's B or D.
Yeah, we'll say B because it's the slight leader right now.
It is.
And then, John, run down the logic games percentages, which again, to me, show intent.
Yeah, well, this is where things get kind of interesting because clearly they've been avoiding A wholeheartedly. And then you get to games, and A suddenly jumps back into the mix. A is the most common answer in the final 5 questions in logic games at 22.3%. B is 20.4%. C is 19.2%. D is also 19.2%. And then E, lagging, is 18.9%. So they have sort of flipped the script here a little bit in games.
Yeah, they inverted it. And every once in a while, someone will be like, aha, see, it is random. And I'm like, it isn't
it's
random.
Not. If there was anywhere for them to have A be the most competitive answer choice or the most common answer, it would be in games. As you just explained, it's the place where things are the most definitive, the most black and white.
And you also have to do the work anyway.
Exactly.
You know, if F is 4th, then which of the following could be true? Well, once you see F is 4th, you're starting to do the work. You're already invested in that. You're not going to get lucky. It's not the answer that's actually making sense with the question.
Yeah.
It's the work that you did.
You're not
in
debating.
The problem.
Yeah, you're not debating the merits of A, B, C. You have it.
Yeah.
You find it. Games is much more a sort of like Where's Waldo of correctness, as opposed to reading and LR, where it's much more of a comparative estimation.
It's a gray area. Which one does weaken it the most? Well, that's a matter of some debate. Whereas F can be 3rd, M can be 3rd, G can be 3rd. These are not really matters of debate. You can prove them definitively. It's much more precisely defined, which is just another way of saying what you said quite rightly. So when we get down to this end part, that 22.3% on A, to me, is in a lot of respects entirely predictable. This is where they're going to make it up and they're going to balance it out so that when you start looking at A overall, it doesn't look so bad, even though they drained it entirely out of both logical reasoning and logic games.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yeah. And, again, in the last 5, interestingly enough, D is the most common. It just isn't the most common in any individual section. If you're using an acronym to try to track that last 5, there is not, some really elegant one. But if games is A and logical reasoning is E and reading comprehension is B, you could take the GA, LERB and come up with, I guess, something like Gaylurb. That's about Galurb. That's the best I got.
Yeah. That's not so much an acronym, but just a flim. I'll be curious.
Yeah,
I'll be curious.
A.
Can I petition listeners to submit your own? I want to hear what people have to say.
Yeah, well, if they have to use just those letters, it's trouble.
Well,
that's the best you can do with those letters.
Yeah. Make them as
Lurbga. You want Lurbga instead?
Yeah.
Legarb.
Make them as not safe for work as you please. We can take it. Send us your filthiest acronyms for whatever those 3 would be.
I don't know if that's gonna. It's gonna be tough to come up with anything that's too bad there.
Maybe.
Even if such a limited combination.
I don't know. I feel like you might be selling our listeners short. Surprise us. Shock our ears.
Well, either way, you can kind of see how as you start looking at it more and more closely and you pull some interesting segments out, you start with the entire test, then you start with each section, then you look at the last 5 in each section, slowly you begin to realize that there is intent behind all of this. And that's just something to understand. I mean, this is the psychometrics of the test. You're being attacked in every way from every direction. Be aware of it. Nothing is random.
Yeah.
We've said this many times. it behooves you as an LSAT student to go out there and learn these things and understand it. And I realize some people are like, man, this is boring. I hear you, man. I feel you.
Oh,
But, you know,
you're reading my mind.
your future and how much you make or your satisfaction and happiness, if that's boring to you, then yeah,
Fair.
tune out on this.
Tune out.
I don't have a whole lot of sympathy for somebody who's like, I don't want to learn it. I'm like, look, you've chosen to engage in this endeavor. Be as good as possible, man. Strive for the stars. Do your possible best and get in there and just know this so that if you do end up in a situation where you have to guess, you're at least making the best possible decision at that moment.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, frankly, looking at the last 5 in each section, the fact that there's an over 2% difference between what should statistically average out at 20 versus what is, it tells you, again, there's reason to know this. There's reason to, change your strategy based on it. If you're really running out of time in games and have to guess, knowing that A is going to be 22% correct, guess A. Why would you not?
That's right. And I think you posed a question before is like, if you look at some of these sections, if you know at the end, like in logical reasoning, that A isn't going to appear as much, and the same thing with reading comprehension, does that mean that it's going to appear more earlier in the section?
I mean, statistically, of course, it has to.
It has to.
Yeah.
They got to balance it out somewhere because we know that in logical reasoning, overall in the section, A shows up 18.8% of the time. In the last 5, it only shows up 15.1%. So earlier in the section, it's showing up more than 18.8% of the
It
time.
has to. Yeah, if I'm going to close my eyes and throw a blind dart at question 6, I'm going to throw it at A because we know it's not going to appear at the end. It must appear more earlier.
Yeah. And so it's probably, I don't have the stats right off the top of my head with like any individual question because I'm not insane. But
that would be remarkable. I feel like,
John, actually, number 6 is a B by S. Light Hair. No, I don't know. The data exists, obviously, but I just don't have it memorized at that level. I'm not completely crazy. But you're exactly right. There's more A's earlier in that section than there are later. And this is where you could drive yourself crazy. You know, there's some people who say to me, I really want to get deep into this. I'm like, don't. Understand the general ways that this moves and then use that information. Don't start thinking that you need to know what the stats are at question number 10.
right.
Think about where you're most likely to guess. It's the end. So understand the way that works. Have a way to just remember that. For everything else, guessing D in a lot of instances is going to work out just fine.
Yeah. This is all well and good for the test as a whole, for your sort of sectional strategy. However, what good test takers will probably recognize is that the answers most likely to occur at the end are in some way dependent on the answers they've chosen so far.
Yeah, nothing exists in a vacuum.
Precisely. So, taking this out of that compartment, let's talk a little bit about what I think is actually the most appropriate strategy in terms of end section guessing.
Yeah, this is my favorite strategy as well.
Yeah.
It's one that I've been advocating for a long time,
Oh,
years and years.
I wonder if you put a year on it, like a date.
I don't know how long it's been.
46
It's been
years Dave has been telling people.
It feels like it's been at least 20 years, but it's probably longer that I've been advocating this particular strategy. This is what we call the high-level scorer strategy.
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit less about what you are looking at with the percentages, which is a simplified approach. Hey, this is what they've been doing historically. They're going to probably keep to this. These are the guesses. D's most common, Then you've got your Galurb strategy in the last 5.
Someone is going to give us something so beautifully golden for that. I'm convinced.
I hope they do.
I hope so
Send
too.
those to John. But this is the strategy that we're talking about is one that, especially when I was working with higher level students, we'd look at these tests and we'd realize that, in some cases there were certain answers that just weren't appearing. And then all of a sudden they were appearing at the end. Mm-hmm. And the idea was they drained that answer out of the early part of the section and then they used it at the end. and then it appeared like 3 out of the last 5 answers. And so when you used to have the paper test and you were writing out the Scantron, it was really easy to see all your answers and make a quick analysis like, hey, you know what, there haven't been any B's in this section, or there's just one that I chose up there. I'm going to guess B on these last 4 or 5 that I'm actually dealing with.
Right.
And the analyses that we have run tell us that if you are a fairly good test taker, this is the best strategy overall. Now, here's where it's not such a great strategy. If you are struggling with this test still, and you haven't broken out of the 140s, or you're still stuck in the 150s, first off, that's okay. Keep working. All right, that's the important thing. But secondly, this strategy is not for you yet. Hopefully it'll be for you eventually, but you need to be getting a majority of the questions correct for this to actually pay off and work pretty well, because you are relying upon the accuracy of your former answers. And what you are doing is, as you get down to the very end, you get down to those last couple of questions you're guessing on, what you would have been doing was looking back and saying, which answer choice haven't I used?
Right.
Which is the least appearing answer? Oh, in this section is E. In this other section, it was B. And then you would use that as your guessing strategy. But if you are missing so many questions that your early answers are inaccurate, that's not a great strategy for you. I also think if you're scoring like 178, this is not a good strategy for you, because you're going to get through all the questions. You're probably not guessing. You don't need to think about it that way. You just need to go do the question and try to get it right. But if you're at that like 70% correct right, or 80% correct, or even 90% correct, this is the right strategy for you in terms of how this works. And so you just look for the answer choice that has appeared least, and you use that at the end. It's the least appearing answer. I like to say that they drained the answer choice out of the swamp of answer choices.
Or in this case, yeah, they've left some lingering majority for the very end. If you've only picked A once, by the time you get to question 20, guess A, etc.
Yeah. There's a variation on that too. I've always thought that if you're getting down to the very end and you've just had an answer, let's say that you were in, you used D on 19, 20, and 21, and you're now getting down and you're thinking, I should guess D, but you just saw 3 of them in a row and you feel pretty comfortable about your performance, don't guess D.
Right.
Move to a different answer choice at that particular point. Same thing in logic games. In the last 5, A is going to appear a little bit more than the other answer choices. So if you just did questions 19, 20, and 21 in the logic game section, they were A, don't choose that one then. All right, move to a different answer there. Now, there's a problem these days, though, John.
Yes.
With this strategy. And I can tell you that you and I are going to lobby them this upcoming year to make this change, because we know it's possible.
Uh-huh.
What's the problem with this strategy these days?
It's much harder to see what you've chosen in terms of answer choices. Looking back, you can see which questions you've answered because there's a little black bubble at the bottom of your navigation bar on screen, but you don't know what you picked. So it's very difficult to be like, you know what, I've only picked B twice through these first 21 questions. You can't see that without actually scrolling back through the questions themselves.
Yeah.
Versus what you mentioned before, which was the Scantron, where you could kind of see the Christmas tree of it all.
Yeah, and so one way around that is, as you go through, just note your answers.
I've had students ask me this question: is it worth the time for me to just make like a 1 through 25, say for LR, and write down the answers that I've picked for each question?
I don't love that.
I don't either.
Here's the problem. Again, hopefully you're able to get through all the questions and this is not an issue. All right, that's the goal, is to get through all the questions and never have to guess. This is the discussion that we really don't want to have, because we don't want anyone to guess. And we probably should have said that right out of the gate.
I mean, if that's not just intuitively presumed, they don't know who we are.
Well, you're probably right about that. But, we don't want you to guess. It's a lot of time and effort to write it all down. And I feel like you are better served by doing the problems and not worrying about having to write everything down. Unless you're finishing, kind of like in a way where you're working really fast. It's not
But you
going to
see,
work
you
either
see
way.
how that actually runs counter to the whole principle of guessing in general. If you're
Yeah.
having to blind guess, it's because you ran out of time. If you have the time to actually note your answers, you probably don't have to guess. So,
That's succinctly stated.
uh-huh.
So, I mean, I don't love that. Here's what I would really love, and this is what we're going to lobby them for. When we were building our test interface system, our digital platform that delivers questions, and, kind of working on the screens, one of the things our developers did, and they work here internally, so they're familiar with the LSAT and everything, but one of the things they did was they didn't realize they were used to Scantrons. And so the little bubble row at the bottom with the answers, when people selected an answer, our system initially showed the answer in the bubble. So we could look across the bottom of our test when they were in development phase, and if question number 1 was A, it would show like
Right.
A there, and it would be blacked out with the letter in white. And then if number 2 was E, it would show E, and so on. And I was like, this is so cool. And then of course, we look carefully at the LSAC one, and theirs didn't do it. And so we actually got rid of a feature that I think is really awesome.
Yeah.
But we also know if we can do it, they can do it.
Ours was too cool, turns out.
Too cool for school.
Too cool for LSAC school.
We had to kill it. There's a few other things that we killed too because they just don't exist on the test. And of course, obviously, stuff like analytics that we have, we left in there. But this is a good example of something that I know I'm going to be asking them to reinstate. And they've been fairly responsive to requests that we've made when they see the overall student good. And given that this would actually return the test to a closer facsimile of what we saw on the old paper and pencil Scantron, I don't know that they will object. I think they might be like, oh yeah, people used to be able to see their answers. They might, and if somebody's going on to question 12 and they're like, what did I answer for 10? Did I choose A or B? And they can glance down and see A, that's a fairness issue. I don't think that's something that, they should object to. So I think we're going to lobby them in 2021 on maybe making that change. And I think that would help people who are really good at this test and answering the questions, but run out of time because they'd be able to see their answers and know immediately which answer they'd chosen the least up to that point.
Yeah, we'll see how responsive they are, but history tells us that they do listen.
Yeah. They want to put out the best tests.
Yeah.
They want to actually be responsive. They don't want people mad at them for something that is easily controllable or changeable. I mean, nobody really wants that in their life anyway, so I know they're the same on this.
I know they don't want it, although they do manage to really breed it.
Some things seem to cause it, yes.
Regardless, I think this is there's a platform that we have here that I think we could probably get them to concede. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll do what we can on that. And that would be a really nice thing, especially for those people who are in that position that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
But as you can see, the overall is, if you just don't know and you don't want to think about it, guess D. But it changes according to each section, and then it really changes specifically in the last 5, and you can use that information to your advantage. But one last time, it is only for blind guessing where you have not looked at the problem. Do not use this information to try to decide between 2 answers because that is far too localized a decision, and these statistics are far too broad in comparison.
Yeah, and best strategy, bar none, is if you have some sense of what you have and haven't chosen and you're reasonably accurate, then choose the thing you've picked the least. That's going to be your most likely answer choice.
I like it. Anything else to say about guessing?
Don't. Answer every question with a knowledge of what it is that you want to choose. That's my final statement.
But if you can't get to the question, then make sure 100% to guess on every single one of them.
My point was finish with time to spare and feel good about every answer you've picked. And then you don't have to worry about any of the things we've been talking about.
Okay. All right. That's what everybody wants. Yes. Become perfect, and then you won't have to worry about any of this.
And if you're anywhere shy of perfect, get in touch with us. We can actually help you get closer.
I didn't know where you were going to go with that.
Thank you.
I think that closes it out. That's probably the only conversation we'll ever have about the guessing strategy. So I will most likely refer to this as the kind of like ultimate kind of reference point on that. I will point out that we do have an article on our free help site about this. It's PowerScore guessing strategy. You can look it up. It's powerscore.com/LSAT/help/guessing.cfm. So all these statistics are there for you to take a look at. We don't have all the complete database of stats there just because there's just so much of it, but what we've talked about is there and you can find it and check it out. And on that note, I think we'll call it for the day. So if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, hopefully you have, leave us a comment and a rating. 5 stars only, please. Send us any questions you have at lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We got the holidays coming up. I hope everybody has a safe and happy holiday season. Jon, I think we'll be back one more time this year with a little 2020 recap and 2021 preview.
Speaking only for myself, only for myself, I would very much like that. I would love to do kind of a retrospective on the year.
It's been a year to remember, for sure.
It's been a year to forget.
It's been both, which is an amazing thing to say about any year. I need a lot more of these peppermint white Russians to forget some of the things that happened, but there have been some good silver linings, and we will talk about those. And we'll talk about 2021, which I think is going to be a really interesting year, not just for the LSAT, but for PowerScore as well. We're working on some really cool new products that we want to talk about and kind of finally make the announcement on some things that we'll be bringing out for people to be able to use next year, and I hope people will be excited about that.
Yeah, I'm biting my tongue hard over here because I really do want to talk about some of this stuff.
Yeah. Let's just say that we have been working hard while we've been working hard at other things as well. So we've been trying to help out with the LSAT and answer questions publicly and so forth, but we've had some good time to put in on the LSAT development side, and so we've got some cool things I think that we'll talk about. But that's in the next episode. In the meantime, everybody stay safe and happy. Enjoy the holidays, and we will talk to you soon.